There should be more respect for the common sense and the judgment of an individual American citizen. I do think that's part of what our country was founded on, and I think that this was an overreach. People want to be taken care of by government. That's the socialist mindset, and I think we're seeing more of it. I think it's on the rise, and the other is on the wane.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thank you for joining us. Today, we have an interesting conversation with journalist Heather Robinson about the crisis about freedom of religion in this country. But before we start, I want to encourage everyone to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find The Daily Show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. This week, Israel celebrated its 75th birthday. The normal cycle of Israeli holidays in which the Jewish state celebrates its Memorial Day, Yom HaZikaron, and then immediately turns to the joy of independence is a jarring yet meaningful observance. But this year's commemorations have been overshadowed to some extent by the divisive debate about judicial reform. Opponents of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government have sought to hijack the celebrations by not letting up on their protest campaign. As we've previously discussed on this program, the claims that judicial reform, in essence an attempt to introduce some checks and balances into a system that now gives virtually all power and no accountability to the country's Supreme Court and judiciary, is an assault on democracy, and to replace it with an authoritarian right-wing regime are false. What the protests are really about is an effort to overturn the results of last November's election, which gave a clear majority to the Knesset, to Netanyahu's coalition of right-wing and religious parties. This is something that the secular and liberal portion of society, whose preferred choices lost that election and which comprise a clear minority of both the overall vote and the Jewish population, isn't willing to tolerate. And since the reform of the Supreme Court will prevent that leftist-dominant institution from continuing to effectively prevent the right from governing, no matter how many elections they win, they see this debate as an apocalyptic struggle. But it's equally clear that this campaign is about liberal elites who dominate the country's establishment, seeking to ensure that those who represent the interests of the nation's nationalist and religious voters, and especially those of Mizrahi background, are kept out of power. Although they call this a battle for democracy, it is actually an effort to subvert democracy. Still, this should have been a week when those who care about Israel should have been able to put aside their differences and to recognize the miracle that the creation of the Jewish state has been. Instead, nonpartisan events like the General Assembly of the Jewish Federations of North America held this year in Jerusalem for Israel 75 have been turned to some extent into a shambles by the protesters as they exercise the heckler's veto over Knesset member Simcha Rothman, one of the architects of judicial reform, and ensured that Netanyahu could not appear without fear of his normal slot at the GA becoming a fiasco. Frankly, the failure of the Federation leaders to hold their event without letting it be hijacked by the anti-Bibi resistance was a disgrace, and efforts by the group's leaders to claim that they weren't responsible for the fiasco are unpersuasive. This is one more example of the failure of American Jewish leadership in which the Jewish establishment has been unable to summon the wisdom or the courage to stand up for Jewish interests and against anti-Semitism of all kinds, as well as to prevent their groups from becoming partisan auxiliaries for left-wing causes. You don't have to be a fan of Netanyahu or know much about the Israeli legal system to understand that Jewish federations and the rest of the alphabet soup organized world should not let their events become venues for this kind of partisan power play. We're going to return to the subject of Israel-diaspora relations later. But now let's turn to an issue that has never received the amount of attention it deserves: the willingness of unaccountable state institutions to wield unreasonable power during the coronavirus pandemic, and the way so many Americans willingly surrendered their freedom in exchange for the perception of personal security that turned out to be utterly false. Examples of this kind of scientific fraud abounded during the height of the pandemic in 2020 and 2021, and echoes of it still continues as so many Americans cling to practices like the wearing of masks, which have now been conclusively proven by the most respected of scientific studies to be utterly useless. Children were deprived of years of education with consequences that are likely to haunt society for decades to come. And houses of worship were closed even while big box and liquor stores remained open, with people of faith being particularly targeted by authorities eager to exercise authority that was unrooted in law but falsely represented as essential to public safety. Can there be any accountability for those who abused power and lied to us so much during those years? Or must we simply forget it all as a bad dream that shouldn't be discussed, leaving us vulnerable to a rerun of that nightmare, should the same people ever get the chance to do it to us again? A case study in how one house of worship was attacked by state power provides a useful reminder of how badly Americans were governed during this period. And we're fortunate to have with us today Heather Robinson, a courageous journalist who has done a deep dive into this story in an important article that was recently published in the Free Press. Heather Robinson is a regular contributor of news features for the New York Post as well as for JNS. She has appeared as a commentator on Fox News and CNN and many other media outlets. Heather Robinson, welcome to Top Story.
Thanks, Jonathan. Great to be here.
It's great to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'd like to touch on a number of issues in this program, but I want to start by asking you to tell us about a story you worked on about the persecution of a church by an American county government during the pandemic. It's one that hasn't been widely told, or at least wasn't until you wrote about it in the Free Press. What happened, and why should we still be talking about it?
Thanks, Jonathan. Yes, well, that story was assigned to me by a great editor, brilliant editor, Margie Conklin, who became aware that a church in Santa Clara County, which was among the more restrictive counties for COVID policy.
This is in California.
In California, yes, in San Jose. They refused to shut down during the pandemic, and they were really standing alone. They have a charismatic pastor, Pastor Mike McClure, who he did shut down for the first 2 months of the pandemic when the county issued a tough order, and he and his parishioners observed they just felt that, anecdotally and in their own observation, that there was no they didn't feel that masks were very effective. They really wanted to worship, and they judged the value of community to be and faith and the way they worship, which is in a group, to be the priority for them. So they didn't shut down. Anyway, what emerged was that the local county government out there and the state government of California under Gavin Newsom were conducting all kinds of questionable policies to what they would probably say, the state would say, to contain COVID. The people of this church felt that they were totalitarian tactics. They were monitoring them in person, but also using cell phone GPS data, allegedly. So this was what came to the attention of my editor, and she felt it was very much a microcosm of the battle that went all across the country between individual liberties and the liberties of community, and the state's view that we needed to shut down everything because of public health concerns. So it was a real microcosm and a dramatic example of that kind of American spirit of independence versus the big government, or you could say public health imperative to protect people at a very high cost to liberty.
Yeah, the story of this church seems emblematic of so many other similar incidents, such as the closing of synagogues and even parks, for example, in Hasidic neighborhoods in Brooklyn. And this was something that should have been unimaginable in a country with First Amendment protections for freedom of worship, but it became almost universal due to the panic about COVID. What do you think this says about Americans in this decade, that people let it happen when, as you spoke to the idea of, sort of independence, even independent spirit, the idea that liberty was a primary value just got forgotten, and people were seemingly happy to exchange it for the perception of safety. And I emphasize the word perception of safety because, as we know, most of these lockdown measures, and including masks, we'll get to that in a minute, didn't really protect them very much. But what do you think it says about us that we let this happen?
Well, I think that it should be said, Jonathan, that I approach this story, first of all, as a journalist, and not as, I had to take off my commentator hat and to really keep an open mind and talk to the county officials and research the actual data as far as mortality from COVID, and to consider their point of view, which was that this was a matter of saving lives. And of course, as you said, much has emerged since the initial lockdowns that tends to argue for the other side, for the side that said that we cannot shut down the world and there is no perfect protection from this virus. However, I do think it should be said that the motives, the self-proclaimed motives of the government, the county, Santa Clara, was to protect lives. I tend to agree with you that I think that there are a lot of things we could do to save lives. We could ban cars. We could, ban alcohol.
All kinds of prohibition. Yeah.
Yeah, there's all kinds of prohibitions that would undoubtedly save many lives, but we don't do it because we balance liberty against the imperative to protect every potential threat, and we also have a healthy skepticism of government's ability to make these assessments for us. So I think that is really the crux of it, and I think that what this says about us as a society is that a lot of people still have trust in government to make a lot of calls for them. And these particular people, these religious people of Calvary Church is the name of the church in Santa Clara County, they wanted to be free, Jonathan, to make these determinations themselves. And I interviewed many of them, and I'm real happy to talk with you about it because it was a wonderful story to work on, but unfortunately, the imperatives of space and time meant that not everybody's perspective could be included. And so I can share with you a little more here that will make it into the story. That these people felt, many of them, that there were competing values that were equally, if not more important, in terms of not just the meaning of life, but saving lives. That, to give you one example, the people I spoke with, the churchgoers, they didn't deny the threat of COVID or that it was a risk, that that the elderly and the vulnerable were at risk. But they made the point in different ways that a lot of people's health, people's mental health, their physical health, their sense of meaning in life was deeply negatively impacted by the shutdowns. And to them, that was an equally, if not higher, concern. One dramatic example that's in the piece, but I didn't get to tell the whole story, is that one of the churchgoers, Marcy Dower, a lovely woman, she's been a practicing Christian for 40 years. very religious woman. She encountered a young woman, an 18-year-old woman at this time near the beginning of the pandemic, who was crying and alone on a pier. She and her husband inquired to see if the woman needed help, and this woman told them she had just been raped. She confided in them. They tried to take her to a hospital. The young woman was too scared to go because of COVID. She was scared to walk into a hospital. She had this mortal fear of COVID inculcated in her, so that even in her terribly compromised state, she wouldn't go to a hospital. She was too frightened to go to police. They took her with them, took her for, tried to get her to eat something, and took her home and stayed in touch with her. And it turned out she wanted to go to church. So they took her the next Sunday to the only church they could find open, which was Calvary Church. And Marcy told me it meant a great deal to this young woman. And that the part that didn't wind up in the story, which I can share with you, is that according to this Marcy Dower, the church woman, this young woman became part of Calvary's community, and she found the strength to go to the police. Marcy felt as a result of the support and the love and the comfort she received. So the point of that story, it really illustrates that, here was someone in crisis who, if it hadn't been for this church, according to, one witness, this young woman would have been psychologically incapacitated. And in other examples, talking to other churchgoers, there were several other examples of, that was the most dramatic one, but several said they were depressed, they were suicidally depressed, they were clinically, out of commission emotionally. I think they were people who, some of them tend to have maybe more than the average person level of issues. But, they have their rights. They're American citizens. They felt this was crucial to their mental health, to be part of a community, the camaraderie, the support, the human contact, and that absent that, their depression, their anxiety conditions were getting worse and worse. So this is what I heard, that people felt, for reasons of meaning, but also health, that the lockdowns were creating more, unintended problems to people's health, physical and mental, than COVID was for most people. And I think it has emerged that I would venture to say, this is a bit of a sweeping statement, but I think most Americans, and listen, my heart goes out to those who died of COVID. It was real. It is real. It's a threat, especially to very vulnerable people. But I think most Americans were more negatively impacted by the lockdowns than by COVID. I think most American families, I know many have a story of losing a beloved relative to COVID, but many, many have stories of not getting medical treatment in time, getting late diagnoses for cancer, deteriorated mental health, obesity that got worse as a result of the lockdowns. And many of these are people who never got COVID. So in terms of the church, this I think initially their perspective was, just that they wanted to worship their God in community, which is what their religion dictates is the way God should be worshipped. But I think that what emerged in my interviews of them was that there were also these mental health and physical health considerations that they felt needed to be addressed by going to church. So, I think that was an interesting perspective that emerged, that this wasn't just about faith, it was also about health and about the fact that...
Well, absolutely. And, there were other aspects of this. I think we, even some of the, bureaucrats now understand the damage that was done to children by closing the schools for so long. And, this is damage that society will be reckoning with for decades, I think, and a generation that will carry this around with them, forever. And it's also sort of speaking to, you said people believe in, a lot of people still believe in government. I wonder also, and this is speculation on my part, I think we're so attuned, number one, to sort of worship health. We live in an age when nobody thinks they should get sick. And that's partly a tribute to the advances of medicine, but also I think we're influenced by sort of the dystopian scenarios that are so much a part of our popular culture. People were really ready to believe that the world was coming to an end. I mean, there are more dystopian scenario series on cable and streaming channels than there were westerns 50 years ago.
It's true. It's true. And we hear all every day about global warming, which I'm also not dismissing, but there is something, I think you're onto something, Jonathan, that there's a cultural obsession with the cataclysm that's coming. And I think we saw it in the 80s where arguably perhaps it was an even more real possibility, nuclear war. I was raised in the shadow of, you may not live to your adulthood because it's going to be nuclear war with the Russians. And, turns out that didn't happen. And, a lot of these catastrophes that we've been inculcated to fear, I'm not saying some bad things haven't happened, but they haven't been the end of the world. And I think you're onto something. I think that there is, dare I say, on the left, a tendency to catastrophize problems that, yes, they exist, but, I would argue that in some cases there's a tendency over there to dismiss the more credible and immediate kinds of dangers in favor of these enormous future anticipated cataclysms.
Yeah, which make for good TV or even movies, but when you get under the details, not as credible as we're often told.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think so. And listen, I mean, it should be said that one thing I did learn in researching the rates of COVID death was that Santa Clara County did have a low, I mean, comparatively speaking, number of deaths compared to, say, counties in Texas or in Florida. Now, of course, there are many variables, such as different age populations in different places, and I don't know that it can even begin to be quantified that these restrictive COVID policies are the primary reason that county had a lower rate of death. But, the government there stands by its extremely severe and restrictive shutdowns. And they argue that they save lives. And, I'm not, in the position to say they're wrong. They may have. But this was again, a weighing and a balancing of imperatives that was a microcosm of the overall dilemma that the whole society faced.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the numbers can be played with. There are places that had less restrictive, even countries like Sweden that had less restrictive policies, and they argue that they didn't suffer any worse and perhaps even less than other people. I think, going back 3 years ago, because it is now 3 years ago in a month, my fear in March 2020 was that the elderly would be sacrificed. I wrote as much, and I thought that was the imperative. As it turns out, although there were instances such as in New York and New Jersey and Michigan.
Local Cuomo did that.
Yes, Andrew Cuomo, now attempting a comeback.
That is what
which I've
I'm
written
not saying
about.
that was his intention, but the elderly were sacrificed.
In
John.
that case.
Yes.
Yeah, but beyond that, it turns out what we really sacrificed were young people. With no basis, in fact, for statistical a threat to them. So a lot of this is very skewed. But let's get back to the story of Calvary Chapel for a moment. Why is that church still being besieged by a lawsuit aimed at collecting millions in fines about mask wearing? And I think that is especially not so much ironic, but perhaps tragic, because the wearing of masks as a preventative measure has already been kind of authoritatively debunked. Just the Cochrane-Lybrand reviews, which is one of the primary medical sources, says none of the masking actually worked. Yet the county wants to collect from this small church.
Well, that's interesting, Jonathan. I have to say I didn't know that. I thought there was some. I thought that what had emerged was somewhat mixed about whether, I think it's pretty clear masks were no guarantee of anything, but whether there was any value or is, I thought was, the jury was still a little out. But I hear you that the much recent scientific evidence seems to point in the direction that the effects are pretty negligible one way or the other. And, interestingly, a couple of the churchgoers I interviewed said that they were subject to a lot of harassment for not wearing masks in their communities. And they were called anti-science and ignorant. But, look, apparently they seem to have had it more right than the so-called scientific people with their common sense. One woman said to me, just something along the lines you hear many people say, which is the virus is so tiny, it can be aerosolized. Unless I had an airtight mask, I knew that this was more of a security blanket than something that would really protect people. So she just, in other words, she was using her common sense, but this is what she felt. And she just, and so she's just one individual. I don't know that she doesn't speak for the whole church or anything, but in terms of why, they're being sued and the lawsuit is the trial is coming up. Yes, it would appear that the county does not want to back off this aspect of their suit. They went back on a certain portion. They took away some of the fines that related to congregating. But this was, they've dug in on the mask issue, and they're suing the church for millions of dollars. It should be noted that the pastor, Mike McClure, did tell me when I interviewed him that he made masks available, and he was not shunning anybody for wearing a mask, or he said anyone was certainly, welcome to. He just simply didn't mandate it. And the reality is that most people didn't wear them there. It's from what I've been told, a very celebratory atmosphere, a lot of singing, embracing, and that's how they worship. And they did not, alter that. And I think that, so in terms of why the county, I asked the county, and they say that the reason they're pursuing this is that all the other churches in the county cooperated and shut down. And they feel that to drop this would be to be unfair. This is their claim to the other churches, And
it sounds like they wanted to make an example of somebody, and that they can't let go of that.
Yeah, certainly. And you would think with what you're citing, this medical evidence that's emerging that doesn't really make a strong case for mask wearing as a major factor in preventing this. The spread of COVID, you would think they might drop it, but they're not dropping it. And as far as I'm aware, the trial is supposed to commence at the end of May. The lawyer for Calvary Church, who I interviewed, Mariah Gondiero is her name. Her case seems to be hinging on two main planks. One is, I think the main argument is that the law was unevenly applied, because she's interviewed a lot of experts, and including the county officials. And one thing that she exposed in her examination of witnesses, in pretrial hearings, is that the entertainment industry and the beauty industry were not subject to this absolutist mask mandate, that there were exceptions made for them. If a production needed to move forward, if someone needed a facial, they made exceptions, but not for
there were all sorts of inconsistencies. Big box stores were open, liquor stores were open, bars were allowed to stay
right.
open.
I'm not sure in Santa Clara County. This I had to really research carefully. They cracked down on a lot. California more broadly, the casinos were open, the strip clubs were open, the liquor store, but this particular county was very hardcore, and they were more consistent than most of California, but they weren't perfectly consistent. They allowed entertainment productions to move forward, and some beauty and spas to conduct things. So this is really, I think, that and the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause, and the special kind of consideration that our country gives to people, to faith. I think those are really at the heart of her legal argument and why she believes she's going to win this case.
Yeah. Well, sooner or later, the Supreme Court upheld the right of religious liberty, even in the middle of pandemics. During this period, not all courts or certainly governments respected that, but it is our first freedom. And although I think some people on the left are uncomfortable with it, I think this is an important principle. Now, this episode, I think, says a lot about the way panic can cause people to abandon their rights in search of the perception of safety. What do you think the implications of this happening are for the future, not just in terms of future pandemics, which, some people, continue to threaten us with, but about the whole idea of freedom at a time when growing numbers of people, especially young people and students, seem to no longer either value or understand sort of basic concepts of freedom of speech on campuses or anywhere else.
Yes, it's very concerning, Jonathan, very concerning when you consider that, again, it's the crux of this story was that these people, including the pastor who, as I said, made masks available, they really weren't against taking precautions. They weren't against people making that determination for themselves. They were trusting the judgment of individuals. And if someone felt that it was worth whatever the risk was to be in community and fellowship, then they wanted that person to have that right. They wanted to respect that person's right. And I think that is a very sacred principle. I felt the same, at the beginning of the pandemic. In my little world, for me, a basic liberty, I'm a very, athletic person. I love to walk and run. And I was, we all were told, right, when we came from New York, those of us who left New York were told we had to quarantine for 2 weeks and sit in a room alone, even if we felt perfectly fine. And I knew I wasn't sick. I just knew it because I felt perfect. And I'm not saying that there isn't such a thing as asymptomatic COVID, although I do personally believe that was overstated. I don't think there were very many people running around with absolutely zero symptoms, spreading this thing wildly. I think that, but anyway, I felt very much that it was my right as an American. Look, people talk about the rights to gun ownership, the right to bear arms, the right to abortion. Okay, but I don't think those rights are more basic than the right to utilize your limbs and take a walk.
Yeah.
If you can't utilize your own body, I mean, in a free country, I will challenge anybody to argue that either the right to, guns or abortion is more fundamental than that.
The right to freedom of movement.
What we were told you couldn't for anything other than what was deemed by the government to be essential, for anything other than food or medical care, you were not allowed to use your limbs to walk somewhere if you were coming from New York to another place. And I'm not afraid to say I did not obey that edict. I mean, I knew, first of all, I wasn't even getting close to anyone. I knew I wasn't endangering anyone, and this flew in the face of any common sense. Even if theoretically I had something, if I'm not even getting near anyone, how could I possibly be transmitting it going for a walk by myself?
Right, yeah.
I think it's an example of what you asked about, people, I had a few people in my life get mad at me for that. They felt that if the government says this is what you're supposed to do, even if it completely flies in the face of any basic common sense, you should do it. And I think that that's concerning because I think when the government can, I think that this was an overreaction. And it's easy to say now, okay, because we have more information. And maybe if we want to give the public health officials every benefit of the doubt and say for the first few weeks, first of all, what hit New York was more severe than what this evolved into. And they wanted to err on the side of caution. And I think that probably their intentions were good, but I do think that this is a free country. This is not communist China. This is not an authoritarian regime. And there's something to be said. Yes, there are laws. You cannot blatantly interfere with the rights of another human being. But when it comes to these gray areas, and when it comes to something that's a matter of your own health, where you're really not even getting near anyone, I just think that there should be, I personally think that there should be more respect for the common sense and the judgment of an individual American citizen. I do think that's part of what our country was founded on, and I think that this was an overreach that is concerning. And most people don't. Yeah, they didn't really, in many cases, have the feeling that they were being restricted in ways that was not respectful of their autonomy and their liberty. And I don't know what to say about that. I guess, the whole ethic of America, that we are a self-reliant people, that we are, capable of assessing risk and free to fail, or, to incur a certain amount of risk, and that's part of the dignity of our lives and the challenge of life. Maybe that is on the wane in this culture. People want to be taken care of by government. That's the socialist mindset. And I think we're seeing more of it. I think it's on the rise and the other is on the wane. And it doesn't make me happy either.
Yeah, I think that's certainly, I think that's a reasonable conclusion to draw from this, especially when so many people were so willing to do whatever they were told. I think also it got bound up in politics. I think the masks, to some extent, became sort of Team Blue's version of a red MAGA hat. And I think the willingness to embrace government power was part of it, and to stigmatize those who sort of didn't want to go along as sort of libertarian nuts. And I guess, my sort of bottom line, my sort of conclusion to this story is that I do wonder the next time, there's another big scare, whether it's one that's credible or, just becomes another sort of Ebola, monkey virus, thing that doesn't really affect most people. What are we going to do? Are we going to do something different? Is the division within society going to grow greater? I think there are going to be more people. No matter how credible the threat is, I think the next time there are going to be more people that will refuse because the medical authorities turned out not to have the answers. And to some extent, we know now that they were lying to us in some ways.
Yeah, and it's concerning because what if it's worse than COVID? What if, this, God forbid, there really is an Ebola virus or something that, and, again, I'm not trying to downplay the fact that COVID was dangerous initially, the more severe strain particularly, and that it remains dangerous to the vulnerable and the very elderly.
Yeah.
But what if there really was something that was like you could get instantly, and it was flesh-eating bacteria that was leveling and killing people right and left?
One of those dystopian scenarios that's a show on HBO or
now people don't
Apple
trust.
TV. Yeah.
Yeah, now people think that there's an element of panic and alarmism and exaggeration. And so if heaven forbid, some kind of genuine, not that COVID wasn't real, but, something much more lethal to healthy people was spreading, and the government said everybody's got to get inside and lock down, and, next time maybe people are going to be, more skeptical. And it's, they shouldn't exaggerate. I'm not saying it was deliberately exaggerated, but, I am saying they shouldn't over panic and over stress and over restrict the population for something that is not a bona fide cataclysm.
Yeah, there's some things I think we'll never know, and I want to sort of put a period on this and then move on to other topics. But, in the early months of the pandemic, I did a study and a piece I did for National Review about the way the New York Times covered COVID in the initial weeks. And sort of throughout February, January and February, sort of the entire Times opinion section and even the news section was all playing it down. And it wasn't until the end of February when it sort of occurred to people that they could use this as a weapon against Donald Trump that they started really going crazy about it. And one of the great what ifs in my mind is, what if Donald Trump played no part in this? How would we have handled it? What would it have? How would it have been spun? And I guess that's a question we'll never know. But it does hang in my mind.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. It's so hard to sort through this Trump derangement syndrome is so extreme and far-reaching that it really wreaks havoc on rational analysis. And as an example, I mean, again, COVID is real and it is a threat and it remains. But now now it almost is like it went from having to be the top focus of everyone's consciousness and shutting down the world, and doctors can't come to work because they're too scared, which I did hear some examples of that. It's schools shut down. Now it's like, okay, except for a few people who've been terrorized and walk around in masks forever, it's like nobody's even talking about it. And you know what? I am concerned for some very elderly friends I have who are vulnerable. That's who's vulnerable to this. And so, again, it's so important, I think, next time around, and to try to be rational about this. And, for those of us who lean conservative, and most conservatives I know weren't deniers that it was real. And most of us did cooperate with precautions. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's what a person of conscience does. And but I think, again, a sense of proportion was lacking. I agree with you. And so let's hope that people are going to be, reasonable going forward.
Heather, I want to turn now to a huge story in our field of journalism this week, and that's the firing of Tucker Carlson by Fox News, their most prominent host. We don't know everything about that firing and what role the lawsuits, both the 2020 Dominion case or a sexual harassment suit of a former producer, played in this decision. Carlson is a controversial figure who has sometimes engaged in behavior that I personally criticize, such as his promotion of an antisemite like Kanye West, and sometimes others in other ways. And, he's, was blasted by the ADL. And I might add, of all the prominent conservative commentators, he was almost alone in being not a fan of Israel. And as I've written, Israel was the one word never heard on Fox News from 8 to 9 p.m. for the last 7 years. But he was also out front and very courageous in his opposition to the moral panic about racism that happened during the Black Lives Matter summer, and about this sort of DEI, as well as being a source of important skepticism about pandemic policies. And the charges by the ADL that he was an anti-Semite for talking about replacement theory were, I think, completely false. What did you think of him, and what do you think it says about journalism today that he was so popular, but yet still unable to hold on to a job despite his ratings and popularity?
Well, I liked him, and I like him, Jonathan. What you say about Israel, I must confess, I didn't know. I mean, I guess I realized it on Fox. It's really Hannity who supports and talks about Israel a lot. I know he's a big Christian Zionist, and I guess I never really noted that Tucker didn't have much to say about Israel, but I didn't. Of course, I'm a great, Jewish American Zionist myself, but I guess I didn't interpret his lack of discussion of it as anti-Israelism, but I felt that in general he is a truth teller, truth as he sees it. I perceive him as the real deal in the sense that I think he is driven by desire to speak and analyze and call him like he sees him. And my hunch is that that's what happened. I think that he was just a little too out there in his views for Fox executives. But who knows? As you said, there's lots come out. And I don't know. I don't know exactly what happened. Interestingly, Robert Kennedy Jr., who's another controversial figure, tweeted something the other day. I don't know if you saw.
He was one of his last guests in his last week, actually.
Yeah, he said Fox fires Tucker Carlson 5 days after he crosses the red line by acknowledging that the TV networks pushed a deadly and ineffective vaccine to please their pharma advertisers. Carlson's breathtakingly courageous April 19th monologue broke TV's two biggest rules: Tucker told the truth about how greedy pharma advertisers control TV news content, and he lambasted obsequious newscasters for promoting jabs they knew to be lethal and worthless. Now, this is a very, extreme position on the vaccinations, which I don't share. But I thought it was interesting that RFK Jr., he noted this, and I've tried to find this April 19th monologue. I didn't see it. I can't find it anywhere. Maybe I'm just missing it, but it looks like Fox pulled it down. So I'm just speculating. I myself do not share these views, but this is something some people believe, and my hunch is that maybe this crossed the line for them. Maybe RFK Jr. is correct in his analysis that, because like I said, I can't find the April 19th monologue. So maybe I'm totally speculating, but maybe Tucker was warned, don't talk about this, don't talk about that. And, again, my speculation, my perception of him is that he's a guy who does not, view himself as a mouthpiece for anybody. And maybe he would cooperate with what Fox wanted.
Well, his, whether you loved him or hated him, his show was kind of very original. You never knew where he was going to go. It was not predictable. Cable news.
And he was a
news is itself kind of very predictable. And
Right.
his show was extremely unpredictable. Now, the business with the vaccines, he was a real vaccine skeptic. Now, as it turns out, the vaccines were overpromised. It turns out they didn't prevent people from getting the disease or prevent them from spreading the disease, although it appears that they were, sort of it enabled people not to get that sick. I mean, it was sort of not what a vaccine normally does, but it sort of helped people, get over the disease. And if so, that was, that's something worthwhile. I might add, I am myself, I was vaccinated. I took all the shots. But the idea that one couldn't talk about this or talk about a lot of the things that he talked about, or being the one to challenge sort of, DEI, the DEI catechism and sort of woke ideas, and sort of in the moral panic of the summer of 2020, he really seemed to stand out as someone who was not being panicked. Now, he's likely to prosper on his own in much the same way that other former cable stars have done. Indeed, ours is a time when niche outlets and independent journalism, whether, in the form of an organization like JNS, where I'm the editor, or Barry Weiss's The Free Press, where you've written, can play a very important role in serving the public in a way that small, non-mainstream outlets never could before, in no small measure because the corporate press engages in so much groupthink, which, the classic case was the Hunter Biden story, and as well as others. The diverse nature of the press today can be blamed for lowering standards, but isn't it necessary? And given the failures of mainstream media, don't we need people who are outliers?
Absolutely, Jonathan. Absolutely. And the other thing I would point out that Tucker was an outlier on, Carlson, was the Ukraine-Russia war. Mm-hmm. He's been a big skeptic, and it does seem to be emerging that, whatever else one believes about it, it doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon, and it doesn't look like it's going so well. And so, this is another example of an issue where he was outspoken in dissent, and there are very, very few dissenting voices, even that seem to be tolerated in the mainstream press, on the Ukraine-Russia war, on the vaccines, on wokeism, and there's criticism of wokeism. That's allowed, but but yes, of the protests that turned violent and the violence that we saw in many places across America happening in front of our eyes, people hurt, people's businesses destroyed who had absolutely nothing to do with the murder of George Floyd. We saw this happening, and we're told by the mainstream press that, this was part of something that should continue. That this was
mostly peaceful.
Right. And we were told to deny what elements of this that were very destructive and hurtful to innocent people. We were told again and again that what we were seeing was not what we thought we were seeing. So this was an example. As you said, Carlson was someone who pointed out certain things that were not being that were taboo to say. And I think you're right that there's less and less of this in mainstream, big media. And so it's the function of the press to be truth tellers, to strive for objectivity, and to, especially those of us who are commentators, like you and I and Carlson, we should be honest when it's our opinion, but we are supposed to be able to have a range of opinions in this free country. And I think it is incredibly important for smaller outlets now and people, whether it's you, whether it's Glenn Greenwald, whether it's Matt Taibbi, people who are doing independent work, both in reporting and opinion, are really what's left of our free press, Jonathan, I think.
I think the groupthink just dominates everything. And I say this as somebody who's criticized, Tucker Carlson. I think his whole role in the Kanye West, mess of last fall was very culpable. But the idea that should, we should just throw people out of the media, cancel everybody who doesn't do things that we like, I think is not a prescription for a free press.
Right. And it would have meant that a lot of aspects of truth, whether you're talking about, the Hunter Biden laptop and what's emerging is a lot of corruption in the Biden family, the problems with some of the vaccines, which isn't to say that they're all worthless and it's, going to kill you. I don't agree with that either. But there are, the efficacy of masks. There are things that we were told by the mainstream media, by virtually every outlet, with no tolerance for dissent, that have turned out to be not true.
Yeah, and branding is disinformation, any skepticism often, which turned out to be valid.
Yeah. So this is a problem, in big corporate media, and so I think that, I'm sorry to see Carlson go.
Yeah, although he'll probably be just fine. I think we're going to see something about whether cable itself is still the dominant media, and he could start his own streaming service and might be out get a bigger audience than them right away. So we'll see. Heather, I want to talk for a little bit about politics before we move on to sort of events in Israel, but. When you were last on this podcast, we were breaking down the midterm results last fall and already speculating about the 2024 presidential election. A lot has happened since then. What has surprised you most that's happened in the last 6 months when it comes to our political battles?
That's a good question. I think that I was surprised by the midterms, Jonathan. We already talked about that. I expected Republicans to do better, especially in my home state these days, Pennsylvania. I was surprised by the upset Fetterman's victory over Dr. Oz. I think in terms of the presidential, what's shaping up to be the presidential lineup, I just read in the Wall Street Journal, it seems that what's being predicted, of course, we know Biden just announced and we know Trump announced, so it looks like it's going to be Biden-Trump again. It's like, I guess I'm a little surprised that the Democrats want Biden. I keep hearing that only 25% of Americans think Biden should run again, and I'm wondering who are these folks, because nobody I know on the left likes him for president at this point, except I guess there are a couple people I know, older Democrats who are very...
You're using that word older advisedly, I guess.
Yes.
No pun intended.
I mean, I think most people in their middle years, seem to prefer that it be someone younger. I heard, not to be ageist, I do think there are certain rare individuals who could do it in their 80s, but I just don't think Biden's one of them. I think
it's interesting. I mean, I've been talking with people ask me about this, and I've been saying all along Biden will run again. They say, well, won't the Democrats stop him? And I'm like, who can stop him? He's president. There are no regional power brokers. It's not 1950. Politics in this country is different. The only person with power is the white, people who run the White House. So I think it's entirely true that maybe 70% of all Democrats don't want Biden, but no one's going to run against him other than RFK Jr. And he may muss Biden's hair plugs up much more than I think many in the corporate media think. Although I don't, it's stacked against him. He can't actually upset him and become the Democratic nominee. But there's no stopping him. And it may be too early to say this, but right now you could argue that Alvin Bragg, the district attorney of in Manhattan, has given Donald Trump a huge lead in the GOP race. So do you think he can hold on to it? And are we really fated to have another rerun of 2020?
I don't know, Jonathan. One thing I wanted to mention before I get to Trump is that I saw Tulsi Gabbard last night on Fox, and I thought she may have had a smart call there. She said that she thinks that the people who want Biden really want Kamala, and they think that Biden will be disabled or worse, during this time period, and that really it's a vote for Kamala. So that's interesting.
Wow, that seems to me a pretty small subset of people who want Vice President Kamala Harris.
Well, the left has become very radical, and I don't. It's hard for me to picture that they really want Biden.
Well, I think they may want somebody to the left, and of course, this administration has been surprisingly not moderate and actually has been bending the knee to the hard intersectional left. That's why AOC is so happy with Biden.
Well, okay, so that's true. Biden really isn't Biden anymore. So that's a great point, Jonathan. Because it's like I would think they'd want someone like Cory Booker or Hakeem Jeffries but I even think, well, I shouldn't say this because I don't want to give them ideas. I think if they were really smart, they'd run Michelle Obama. And I think she'd win. But I don't know that she wants to.
She may be too smart to really want to spend any more time in the White House.
Yeah, I think so. But I think that would be a winner. Yeah. But I think that you're right that Biden is really kind of a stand-in. He's a figurehead at this point, and gives me no pleasure to say that because I'm one of those old school people who just respects the presidency itself. But I think that he is.
Well, he spent his whole life trying to become president, and I've said this, I've written this. He will be dragged out of the White House kicking and screaming. I mean, it would take an act of God to prevent him from running next year. Just as I think it would take an act of God to prevent Trump from, following through and continuing to attempt to get back to the White House. These are two people who want to be president,
Yeah, I don't know why either one of them wants it, to be honest with you. Not just at their age, but, anyway. But, I think as far as whether President Trump, in my humble opinion, has a chance, well, a lot of people counted him out the first time. So,
the polls, since he was indicted on these charges in New York, which I think are pretty flimsy, his poll numbers have gone up among Republicans. They're circling the wagons around him, and his lead over Governor Ron DeSantis, who is the clear only alternative with any numbers outside of single digits, the margin between them has increased, from like 20 points to 30 or 40 points.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. And I think, I really think what it's about is that a lot of people, and I think it's a minority of people in the country, but it's a big minority of people, really don't trust the establishment anymore of either party. And I think they can see by the way Trump and his family are being persecuted by the establishment. And they are, whether you're talking about years and years of the Russia collusion hoax and what that cost in terms of time and effort and taxpayer money for nothing, whether you see the harassment of anyone who stood by Trump in these legal battles, whether it's Rudy Giuliani or all Trump's associates. I think that people see that whatever Trump is, he's not part of this establishment swamp, or else he wouldn't be getting treated this way. And so one of the things that does in the frantic efforts of mostly the leftist establishment of the country, but there have even been some Republican establishment people who've tried to stop Trump. I think what that shows is that it's a panic reaction, as you would say. And what are they so scared of? To those of us who question the wisdom, the collective wisdom that's dragged us into war after war after war for the past 40 years, which have not strengthened our country and have not worked out, who question the huge taxing of the working class in this country to feed an ever-growing bureaucracy that doesn't serve them. These are the people whose sons and daughters fight the foreign wars, the questionable wars that have, whatever you believe about whether they were right or wrong, you have a hard time arguing we won them. And these are the same people who, get up and do the grunt work of the country, the mechanics, the bus drivers, the sanitation workers, the waitresses, the hairstylists, the housekeepers, the people who serve in the military, not to denigrate other kinds of jobs, but these are people who keep the country running. These are people who have not been well served by the establishment of either party in all these years. Now they see Trump, who, whatever else is true of him, had a career outside of government. He built things. He built a company, real estate empire, casinos. He employed thousands and thousands of people. He didn't just make his money in government. And they see him being hounded and demonized and harassed and vilified. And whatever else is true of him, he was a better president than Biden. The economy was doing better. We weren't in any new wars. Lowest black minority unemployment in U.S. history. So, I think people see this and they see they see that the establishment of the country is trying to block him. And it's no mystery to me. That's what they like about him, because they know he may be rude, he may be crude, blah, 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 but he's not just a creature of Washington, D.C., who's done nothing but line his and his family's pockets at the expense of working class Americans. And that's why they love him. And they're going to get behind him. So,
no, I think that's true, and he has retained their loyalty, at least of a critical mass of voters, and indeed he may have a veto over the Republican nomination, even if Governor DeSantis, who I think in the view of many conservatives who agree with what Trump did and want to continue it and want to make the Republicans the party of the working class, now that the Democrats have become the party of Wall Street. But if Trump doesn't get the nomination, they may stay home. They may, whether he would.
That'd be a shame. That'd be a shame, because I think that the country would be, my opinion, country would be a lot better off with either of those men, Trump or DeSantis. I'd like to see them run together, but.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll see about that. Trump is, right now not running against Biden. He's trying to demonize DeSantis, which is kind of crazy. But let's now turn to, I think, one of our biggest stories of the week at JNS, and that is how the debate over judicial reform in Israel has not only nearly overshadowed the country's 75th birthday celebrations, but have also involved leading American Jewish organizations, and in particular the Jewish Federations, who held their annual General Assembly in Israel this week. The leaders of the JNFA have been clearly tilting towards the opposition to the government of Benjamin Netanyahu, which was won an election only a few months ago. What do you think this says about the way American Jewish leadership operates? And why do you think American, Jews think they ought to intervene to help overturn an election and support an unaccountable judiciary in Israel, when most of them take the position that the 2020 election was inviolable and that it's necessary to curb the power of the U.S. Supreme Court?
I really wish they'd stay out of it, Jonathan. I think that Israel and Israeli people need to make those calls for themselves. And I think we are emerging from an era in which, not to revert to our earlier discussion, but the U.S., with all our great intentions, has done a lot of meddling around the world. And I challenge anybody to argue that it's gone well. I think that now we're talking about our American Jewish people, and I think we should just be supportive of the elected government of Israel. And Netanyahu was elected. he has a lot of support. There are a lot of people who don't like him. It reminds me a little of our country, only in the sense that we have this left-right divide, and we saw with Trump, how polarizing he was, and you know how I feel about that. I just think you have to accept that sometimes the other guy wins in a democracy. Just like, those of us who lean more conservative, we can criticize, but to walk around trying to upset the election is not, it's not democracy. I mean, you have to accept the results of an election when you don't like. So I think for Americans to be meddling in this is a mistake. I know it's rather complicated, and I'm not a legal scholar. I don't understand all the ins and outs of what exactly is being debated. I know in a general sense it's the Knesset, which leans, I guess, very slightly conservative right now. They want the judiciary to reflect that, I believe, and not to, the judiciary in Israel has been extremely, extremely left dominated, and they have veto power over who is nominated or becomes the next judges. So, essentially, my understanding is that this means that the judiciary, the left has a lock on the judiciary as it is now, and Netanyahu and his coalition want to do something to allow the judiciary to reflect the range of opinion in society. But at any rate, I just think that, I know it gets very complicated because Israel's constitution isn't like our constitution, and it can be debated back and forth. But between the complexities of it and the fact that it is Israel's government, I just really would be wary of Americans trying to, start to meddle in that. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think what's happened in Israel is very reminiscent of what we saw in this country after 2016. It's not a loyal opposition, it's a resistance. And it's an even bolder resistance than we had in the United States, in part because in a parliamentary system, you have a reasonable hope of overturning, of toppling a government before a set term. There was no way to get rid of Trump other than by impeaching him, and they tried that. But I think, this is about this battle in Israel is a cultural battle. It's about the establishment. It's about the secular liberal establishment that sort of controls most of the levers of a non-governmental power, wanting the courts in Israel and the judiciary to have, power that no American left or right would tolerate the courts having here, because that effectively prevents the right from actually governing, no matter how many elections they want. Now, that's a debate for Israelis to have, and they are having it, and it's a pretty it's a Jewish debate. They're really at each other's throats. My question is, why are American Jews thinking that they have to join the resistance? And partly it's because they feel the Israeli left is using a lot of the rhetoric that Democrats used in the last election about democracy, and I think it's just as disingenuous. But I think it resonates for many American Jews. And I think the question I'll throw back to you is that, do you think there's any long-term fallout in terms of the U.S.-Israel relationship with American Jews taking sides with the liberal establishment and against the majority of Israeli Jews who are nationalist, religious, and Mizrahi rather than Ashkenazi?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's very, very concerning because I just tend to subscribe to sort of the AIPAC approach, which is you support the elected government of Israel. As an American, whose first loyalty is to America and love is to here. But I'm also Jewish and I love Israel. But I trust the wisdom of our Israeli brethren and their right to choose their leadership. So it's very concerning that. I think there's an element of real overreach here. I've never been a big fan of American Jews being highly critical of different aspects of the Israeli government's decision making. I just think, our role really should be to support them And that's not to say that if there's something profoundly wrong, something we really feel strongly in particular is wrong, that we can't disagree with it. But I think, I guess I just think we should generally support Israel. And Bibi's the prime minister. And yes, I think that from what I understand, a lot of the folks who elected Bibi are, they're conservatives, they're the religious, but they're also the Mizrahi, our Sephardic brothers and sisters. And I guess I see a little parallel there to, I hesitate to say this because I know Trump's such a controversial figure, but I do think I would compare them only in the narrow sense that I think they appeal to Bibi and Trump, to a lot of the very, hardworking people who do the grunt work of the country. And I think that, those tend to be great people, and they tend to be people whose contributions and opinions are undervalued here. And maybe the same's true in Israel. So I would just add that.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. And I think a lot of the catastrophizing about things in Israel is, being used for political purposes, just as it does here. Well, Heather, thanks so much for joining us today and for giving us a lot of great insights on the issues. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, or on JBS TV, please like and or subscribe to Top Story, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.